Who is Jesus, and what are these keys of the kingdom of heaven? Yesterday on Market Street, there was a man wearing worn clothes and just socks on his feet. And as he walked along, he kept pushing people at random, people who are waiting in the security line outside Ross's clothing company. Another man crouched in the corner of a bus stop, bent over with his head about the height of his knees, repeatedly just wailing from the very heart as a police officer stood by only 5 feet away with a dog on a tight leash, a German Shepherd. Another man was lying on the ground at Eddy and Mason, and he was lying there with his hair full of litter. Drugs and mental illness touch nearly every person you encounter just down the hill from here. Most of the stores have left, and the world, it seems like it's ending. This is the kind of feeling that pervades the beginning of J.T. Alexander's book, I Am Sophia. It's a science fiction novel of a not-so-distant future when climate change is beginning to make the planet uninhabitable. The center of gravity for human culture seems to have shifted into outer space as investors in places like Mars support companies here in the Bay Area who are doing genetic engineering and carbon sequestration. San Francisco is no longer called San Francisco, but it's called Sanef, and it's one of the several independent states formed after the collapse of America. Like narcotics in our time, many people of the future have become addicted to STIMs. The acronym stands for Sensory Targeted Immersive Mind Tech. It's basically virtual reality, which destroys a person's soul and personality. There's horrifying and dehumanizing levels of inequality, and it's all accepted as normal. Poor people are shunned and called low contributors. There are nihilistic terrorists who frequently kill ordinary people with bombs. There's almost no religion of any kind. People call it metaphysics or metaphys, and they respond to it with a mixture of disdain, suspicion, and fear. In this anti-religious world of the future, there is only one remaining Christian church in the universe. It has 10 worshipers and a bishop who's only 29 years old, whose name is Peter Halabi. And the church is in the ruins of Grace Cathedral, right here. Yes, it's true. That's exactly what I said. In that future time, this building, which I love, has holes in the roof. All the stained glass windows have been boarded up, and no one's going to ever worship where we worship because there's only 11 people coming to church every Sunday. They worship in the Chapel of Nativity. So before you leave today, go and look at the mural on the wall of the Chapel of the Nativity, because that is where Peter is praying at a key moment in the service, in the book. Peter worries about having to shepherd this small group of people, and he wonders if this is going to be the end of the church. And so he looks up the same mural that we look up at all the time. He sees that image of the Virgin Mary, and he says, I'm not asking for a big miracle, just something to let me know that God's still up there. So soon, a tent appears in front of the Gabberty doors, right there, and a homeless woman sheltered there enters the church as Peter is about to read the lesson. And she takes the book from him to read herself, and her first words are, I am. Now, this seems to be a reference to God's self-description in the burning bush before Moses. It is also the way that the Gospels often describe Jesus in the Greek language, and it is the letters that they put on the icons. So in the corners of the icons, it describes Jesus as I am. This young woman has a scar on her face from her cheek to her neck, and she She walks like a dancer, and she calls herself Sophia, which is the word for the divine feminine. So for most of the book, we wonder about this woman. Is she God? Is she Jesus Christ? Is she the second coming? Or is she sick, unstable, and deranged? Or is she just a fraud trying to manipulate the gullible Christians for the sake of her own agenda? Now, this is the feeling of the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus is walking on the water and he rescues Peter, the disciples say, "What sort of man is this?" And the crowd seem to be wondering the same thing when Jesus asks his friends, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now, although all of us have to answer this question in our lives, as readers, we stand outside the experience of those depicted in the Gospel of Matthew. We see the things that they do not see. The Gospel, for instance, begins with these words: an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. And as we read through the Gospel, we wonder when and which one of them will realize who Jesus is. So this exchange between Jesus and Peter happens in Caesarea Philippi. It's the capital of the Tetrarchy of Philip, son of Herod the Great. And Herod the Great dedicated the most famous architectural aspect of that city, the temple. He dedicated it to Rome and to the Emperor Augustus, whose statue stood there in the sanctuary. He was the first emperor to add to his title Divi Filius, or Son of the Divine. So this is the context. Jesus asks his friend who they say he is, and Peter says, "You are the Son of the living God," as opposed to that dead God, that statue that's in the temple. Now, all of us, we realize that Peter doesn't understand yet what he's saying, right? He doesn't understand yet what all this means. And all of us have trouble with this. We think of Jesus as simply a more powerful example of Emperor Augustus, when Jesus is really overthrowing the whole way of being that Augustus stands for. Jesus shows us that the way of domination and self-aggrandizement, although it seems stable and powerful on the surface, it is really like sand that just sifts through your fingers. And in contrast, the way of Peter with his imperfections, his courage and fear, his insight and foolishness, but above all his faith, this is the improbable foundation that is the rock upon which we can establish our lives. And this is the faith which is a kind of pursuit rather than an accomplishment. So Jesus goes on, he says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven." And through history, these are some of the most misused words in the entire Bible. They've used to justify the church in those moments when we've been most like Emperor Augustus and least like Jesus. It's as if some institutional authority in Rome or Canterbury could have any power over whether a person is saved or not. And this could not be further from the truth. The biblical scholar Herman Waitchen, who I love, he points out several ancient examples that clarify what Matthew really means. The power of the keys, according to Herman, has more to do with setting policies and procedures than with determining which individuals will be saved. For instance, the historian Josephus writes about Queen Alexandra. She was the one who ruled the Hasmonean kingdom from 78 to 69 BC. And she deputized Pharisees who were administrators of the state and gave them the power to, quote, loose and to bind, just in the same language that we hear in Matthew. So for Herman, this power is about determining what practices are permitted and what practices are forbidden. And we all of us here have a role in this. We all in our way preach the gospel through what we say and how we live. We contribute to the picture of what is acceptable. And we have a responsibility for creating the kind of society which is humane in its care for the kind of people that I saw on the street of San Francisco yesterday. Now, the Puritan theologian John Calvin from the 16th century writes that the reason that we have this passage about the keys of the kingdom of heaven is for you to realize and to be strengthened by it. He says that preaching the gospel of Jesus in your life, like I just described, is terribly dangerous. And it is important for us all to know that we are doing God's work and that God stands beside us as we do this. I was so lucky. I have my dear friend Bob here today. And I was in the vestry, and I was cutting all the sections out of the sermon that I was going to cut out because I wanted to make the sermon the right length. And Bob said, don't cut those sections out. So thanks to Bob, we have this next section. And he's going to love this. This is right up Bob's alley. It might not be up your alley at all. But the 20th century theologian Karl Barth writes that the thought of God will always disturb the world. Our relations with each other will never be perfectly clear. We will never adequately understand our true situation in the world. And that is the reason why we need to orient ourselves toward the eternal, toward God, toward the heavenly. And that is the reason that Barth says this: for the vast ambiguity of our life is at once its deepest truth. We know that our thinking of the thought of eternity is never a thing completed in time. Our attention to Jesus, our prayer, is how we avoid being conformed to the world. It is how instead we are being transformed by the renewing of our minds in Christ. Now, about half the book in I Am Sophia takes place right here in Grace Cathedral, and about half of the book takes place on Mars. And in the book, Sophia turns out to have been terribly abused as a child, but she was someone who also found nourishment in ancient books like the Bible and other Christian writings. And this makes her a kind of theologian. Was Sophia the Christ? I would hate to spoil that for you if you were to ever read this book. As he finds himself falling in love with her, though, Sophia has a great deal to teach that young bishop and us. She says, quote, "You are the guardian of a great treasure. It is your tradition, and it has an incredible spiritual value and almost miraculous capacity to change lives for the better. But you misplaced the keys to the treasure when scripture and religion became primarily about trying to determine who was right and who was wrong." And later, Sophia gives a kind of blessing. She says, "May your soul have deep roots and wings." And this means that the followers of Jesus need to have a foundation, a stable identity, but we also need room to evolve. Changes in technology and society leave modern people less rooted and more focused on wings. And you see this in this strong emphasis that we see around us on individual freedom, on innovation and progress. And in contrast, many of the Christians we read about in the newspapers regard the secular world as destructive and evil and off track. And this leads them to become so backward-looking that they are all roots and no wings. The living, loving God of the gospel becomes to them something static and oppressive. What does not evolve dies. For generations, people at Grace Cathedral have known this, but it is up to us if we will continue to have roots and wings. Near the end of the novel, Sophia says to Peter, "You think strength means being untouched by the suffering we are approaching. You still do not know me." Will the San Francisco that we know and love die as people obsessively seek to save themselves? Will the future of Grace Cathedral lie in ruins? Will the world know who Jesus is? At the center of Grace Cathedral is not a statue of the emperor or a belief in domination and self-assertion. At the heart of our being is a living person, the living child of God. He calls us by name and offers the keys to a deeper, more humane, and faithful life. Come, let us follow Jesus.